The National Police Association talks a lot about, and we get involved in cases involving the wrongful punishment, the wrongful firing, the wrongful prosecution of law enforcement officers in this country. So I have been wanting to bring this guest to you who really is an expert in this field and can help us understand why police officers are not only being punished, disciplined, and fired for doing their jobs, but are being prosecuted in the criminal courts in this country. Von Kliem, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Von, I'm going to ask you what I ask every single cop that comes on this show. Why did you become a cop?
Oh, I appreciate the question for a lot of reasons. A lot of people forget I was a cop. They're like, oh, he's an attorney. And I was like, well, no, I'm a cop with a law degree, but I actually did a lot of litigation. So that doesn't play well with some of the audiences either. But why did I become a cop? It was very simple for me. A friend of mine and I were breaking into a high school gymnasium. And by breaking in, I mean, we jimmied the lock because we wanted to work out. And lo and behold, I got in there. There was a bunch of cops in there doing defense tactics training. And so I kind of looked around. They didn't blink. They're like, hey, come on in. And they let us play with them and do wrist locks and takedowns. And it was the first time I met police officers in real life that weren't in uniform. Was very intrigued at that point. And they told me about the reserve program. And I was right at that turning point. I think I was probably 18 years old, getting ready to turn 19 maybe. And they said, well, we have a animal control officer position open. We have a reserve police department open that would help you, a reserve program that would help you get full-time policing if you want. And I was at that time of my life where I simplified it to this. Do you want to be a good guy or a bad guy? Do you want to be the problem or the solution? And it was that simple. And I committed to being a good guy. And to me, if you're going to be a good guy, that means you are a police officer. And I don't know where that association came, other than grew up in a military family. My dad made a big deal about rule of law and respect for authority.
Now, throughout your police career, you did a lot of different things. When did law school come onto the scene?
Yeah, it was easy. So I was a cop pretty much full time from 93 to 03. And towards the end of that, I did what most cops did. I ran our DT program. I ran our de-escalation program. I worked our special operations. I was doing, back when ASLIT was a big deal. I was running around going to every ASLIT thing I could go to. But I took it very seriously. I was studying the law, even as a cop, because we were writing search warrants and I wanted to be good at what I did. I was co-teaching with the attorney. So I was doing the tactics side and they were doing the law side. And so we would team teach. One day I went to court and I was trying to explain why I, in fact, did have probable cause to the attorney. The attorney was like, well, when you go to law school, you can tell me how to do my job. And I said, I'll be right back. And it was as simple as that. And I was working narcotics at the time at night. So I went to law school during the day, worked narcotics at night, and ran that up until 9/11. And then when 9/11 happened, that's when I made the switch from full-time policing to full-time practice of law. Joined the military as a judge advocate because it was time to go serve. But I always knew I was coming back to be a cop. So I was still just a cop with a law degree who was serving post 9/11. 4 years. And then of course I made it a career. So I ended up retiring out of the military as a judge advocate. Interestingly, I think people know I stayed on as a civilian cop though. I kept coming back weekends and holidays when I could. So even as a full-time judge advocate in the Army, I'd find as many opportunities I could to work as a reserve, to stay on the street as a cop, because I never let it go. I always thought that's what I was coming back to. So that's where I made the pivot. And was glad I did, but it was always, just to be a better cop, really.
Police officers, we've all known, since we got on the job, that there's a good chance at some point in our career we'll be litigated, that we will be involved in some sort of civil lawsuit for, a wrong that we really didn't commit. And that's part of the job as a cop. But in the last 10 years, especially in the last 4, we have seen this switch from not just civil litigation, but the addition of police officers being charged criminally simply for doing their job. What have you seen in the last 8 to 10 years?
Yeah, I'll say three that just popped into my head, reasons for why that transition took place. I'll try to remember them. The first thing is understand when there was a shift to police reform, right? They were trying to create a narrative that the police were the oppressors and the suspects are the victims, they're the oppressed. And there was a certain segment of population that uh, actually ended up in either the activist group, the progressive group, but they were powerful politicians in the legislature running cities. And after the George Floyd death, they had a tsunami of support backing them. There was nothing standing in the way of advancing every reform effort they could imagine. There were some academics who'd been preaching for years about progressive reform efforts and this idea of holding officers accountable. Well, their idea of accountability and mine were different. We focus on this thing called honest accountability. Honest accountability is two main things. One, the standards that you use to regulate police conduct have to be clear enough that an officer can predict the lawfulness of their own behavior, right? That's just a due process requirement. And when you start seeing things like minimum force necessary and use force only when appropriate, and you know, de-escalate when possible and only use force that's necessary, we would look at that and like, I don't think cops know what that means in advance of using force, right? That's why we have a reasonableness standard that is fleshed out through case law and then fleshed out and operationalized through training, right? And we sort of, the contours of reasonableness have crystallized because of case law and training. But when these progressive reform guidelines, use of deadly force as a last resort, only force when necessary, these sorts of things were popping in. They were having trouble bypassing qualified immunity, right? Because as you know, qualified immunity on the civil side requires that we only hold officers accountable for excessive use of force if the excessive nature or excessive quality of that force would have been obvious to any reasonable officer. And by obvious, they mean beyond debate. And that's a high standard. That is a standard that the courts have utilized that recognize the often unpredictable, uncertain, and discretionary function of threat assessments and responses, right? And so reasonableness, and reasonable people could disagree, and you don't have to choose the best option or even a better option. You just have to choose a reasonable option, and that has always been the guidelines. Well, because qualified immunity was acting as sort of a bulwark against this concept of accountability, which to them meant if you shoot somebody, you should suffer the consequences of that. It was like they failed to recognize legitimate police shootings and reasonable police shootings, but instead focused on the racial disparity aspects of it. And so to try to mitigate the racial disparities, which is clearly there's racial disparities in the criminal justice system. The problem is they've equated racial disparity to racial discrimination, and that's not clear to me, nor have they seemed interested in making that case. So that was the first part. The second part of honest accountability is this idea of you can't have expectations beyond human performance capabilities, right? And so we would come in at Force Science and we would say, yes, I understand what you're trying to hold the officer accountable to, but no human could do what you're asking, right? And that's the shorthand version of it. So because they weren't getting over the qualified immunity, we predicted, and in fact, it wasn't a hard prediction because the academics were writing about this as a recommendation, that they just bypass civil suit and go criminal. The criminal gatekeepers were supposed to be the prosecutors. Well, we saw what happened. We started getting progressive prosecutors who also were actually running on a platform of holding officers accountable. Well, these are people who didn't understand either the due process argument relative to the standards by which we were holding them accountable to, because they were all new, right? By definition, if it's progressive and it's reform, it does not reflect the traditional law enforcement interests, which means it doesn't reflect current policy. It doesn't reflect current training. And remember, training is where we operationalize policy. And so we bypassed that. We sort of rammed it through legislation. We rammed it through best practice policy development. We rammed it through 30 guiding principles. We rammed it through all sorts of really high level, even police associations that got on the police reform um, effort, right? And so when we started seeing that, we predicted they were going to bypass civil suits, bypass qualified immunity, and just go criminal. And then we lost the gatekeepers. So now we have prosecutors who are either just progressive reform activists trying to hold officers accountable, either unjustly if they don't know what they're doing, or corruptly if they do. Um, Now, having said that, Betsy, it's really important for me to make this point because force science has a reputation that there's not a cop we won't defend. We certainly will never let anybody forget that there's a human involved in these cases, and that human factors and human performance and the perfectly imperfect nature of humans always matters, right? And so if they're going to respect those things, we're going to come in, we're going to remind them of those things, and let the chips fall where they may. But I would tell your audience, we certainly see cases where there's no human performance aspect, legal aspect, or police practices aspect that can justify or explain the excessive quality of force we're seeing. And we will let them know that. We see those cases with some regularity, but even saying that, we see the toughest cases. And so what I would say is I would, if I had to put a percentage on it, still probably 95+% of the cases we see are absolutely legally justified shootings or uses of force. Um, that's not to say we don't see bad policing out there. We certainly do, and we call it like we see it. But the good news is cops are still making incredible decisions under really tough circumstances. And I think we're focusing more on the planes that crash than the planes that are landing safely.
Yeah, that is very well said. I think that, and this is something that I want people to know about for science. It's not just a bunch of attorneys who are defending cops, it's researchers and trainers who are uh, working hard to get not just law enforcement, but the general public to understand why cops do what they do. And they treat police officers, like you said, as humans, and kind of as athletes as well, because again, cops are out there doing incredibly physical things, and we are affected by everything from our size and our gender and our age to how much sleep we've had, nutrition, training. Talk about some of the realities of that.
Yeah, the training realities. We've been teaching with Chris Butler, Chris Butler's program called Methods of Instruction, and really what that course has done is really highlight there's a right way to train too, right? And historically, police have trained with the amount of time they had, with the resources they had, with the money they had, on top of their operational requirements. And um, if you are a professional athlete, you would know that's wholly insufficient, right? For the expectations we had on police officers. We were doing comprehensive use of force decision making before it was a thing, right? We want them to know the basics and know the basics well. Well, the expectations of the community has gotten so high now that we need to be expert communicators at the highest level. We need to be psychologists. We need to be counselors. We need to be you know, medical first responders, and we need to know how to shoot straight, hit hard, and have the wisdom to know when, right? All these things, and be expert report writers and have amazing memories, and all these things come into play in all these cases. What force science has done is we look at all the disciplines, right? We look at research across multiple industries, whether it's sports, medicine, perception, cognition, and vision, whether it's national highway traffic safety studies, military studies. We look at any discipline that touches human performance and human factors, and we look at the research they did there. And then we funnel that into either force science news or our training programs or our keynote addresses. Um, in the findings that were relevant to humans in other industries, are those findings also relevant to police officers? And of course, we also train and represent civilians. So what if it applies to a police officer, it applies in our civilian cases as well. And a lot of people forget that. But we translate that to to the industry so the industry can operationalize it. Like essentially saying, if these things are true, how does that affect your training practices, your operational tactical decision making and performance, your investigations, right? How we investigate crimes, what we can reasonably expect from memory, what we can reasonably expect in the questions and answers that we are generating during the investigation, and then in post-investigation evaluation. So, and now we've also added the political aspect. So we have what we call these lines of effort where all these human performance issues get funneled down into one of these 4 or 5 areas. And so when you're talking about the training aspect, there are specific ways in which humans learn. And so it's not just well, the first thing is, what are you teaching them? You got to do curriculum selection and then curriculum development, and then it's curriculum presentation and testing, and it's boosting and priming, it's interleaving, it's how do you present the information in a way, not just that they can pass a test on Friday, which is how we traditionally done it, right? I'm going to teach you on Monday for a test on Friday, new subject. Teach on Monday, test on Friday, new subject. What we found was, while that might have higher test scores on Friday, from an operational or transference standpoint, meaning from the training room to the street, when we transfer to the street, there wasn't the same level of retention you would expect to have. So we looked at the science of learning. We worked with Chris Butler. He developed this program. We helped present that. We now have a program that's in development on the science of learning, and it's a little bit different angle. It's a little bit more expanded than what we were teaching. Still supporting Chris Butler's work, and now we're gonna push that out a different direction as well. But to your point, there's not just what you teach, but how you teach it that matters, and we want to make sure the industry understands that. And it doesn't necessarily have to cost more money, and I think a lot of people are surprised by that.
Well, yeah, and police training, it does cost money, and in an era of defund the police, and when we have less police, the training aspects can become very difficult, can't they? Because I think, again, one of the things that civilians don't understand is, A, you got to have money to train your cops and the right trainers, and B, you have to have personnel enough to be able to allow some of your police officers to attend training while others handle the business of answering 911 calls and all of that. And you guys have you go around the country, not just defending cops, but Force Science does quite a bit of training, and you have a big conference coming up, don't you?
Yeah, we do. So the conference is September 24th through 26th. I still think there's some tickets available. It's actually a pretty incredible lineup. There's 14 really top level instructors that are coming in, researchers, in fact, some of them the top in their particular industries. I'm excited to see Dr. Mark Green coming. He's perception, cognition, decision-making guy, mostly worked in the traffic investigation world, but he actually is a police expert witness as well, because those concepts apply in policing. And when you have someone at the highest level of their industry making those connections and recognizing that application, then we can certainly have confidence in doing that as well. So yeah, September 24th to 26th. It's just in the Chicago, Illinois area. It's in Des Plaines, Illinois. We're excited about that. I'm going to be going through one of the high profile cases, the Rayshard Brooks case. We were part of that, actually the prosecution investigation that we worked on. Ultimately, they decided not to indict those officers. And I'm going to go through what we learned in that. And there was I learned a lot. I was surprised by what we found, and I think the audience will be as well. So yeah, if you can make it to that, please do. We're really looking forward to an outstanding lineup.
Before we conclude real quick, I'm going to throw you a little curveball. You're a cop's dad. That changes everything, I think. What do you want other police parents to think about?
Oh, that's a great question. I can tell you what I thought about. I was very selective on the agency that your kid works for. I wanted to make sure that the politics hadn't infected the decision making of your agency and your civic leaders. I wanted to make sure that the officers were still having realistic expectations placed against them and how to accomplish their job, their mission, and be held honestly accountable. So that was the first thing. I make sure my son knows that competency comes before confidence. They got to train. They have to put the time in the mat rooms. They got to put the time in on the range. They have to take training and study seriously. The communications aspect of it is big. The way I frame it for my son, and you guys can steal this. You have to work really hard to, there's two things I'll say. One, work really hard to talk people out of fighting. Work really, really hard to talk people out of fighting and avoid the use of force, because then when you have to use force, there's a lot of power in being right. That's the first thing. The second thing is, look, we do our defense tactics training to reduce the population of people who can kill us. And we do our communication and de-escalation training to reduce the population of people who want to try. But even as I say that, there's always still a population of people who are going to want to try. And for them, it's not confidence that's going to help you survive those encounters. It's competence.
Great advice for anyone thinking about law enforcement or any young cop out there. Von Kliem, where can people find you and find Force Science?
Yeah, forcescience.com. It's one word, FORCE science.com. That's our website. You go there to sign up for our conference. Also, if you have cases out there, I run our consulting division. We're involved in most of the high profile cases in the country. It's a free pre-consult. Click the link, fill out the form. We'll get in touch with you and we'll talk a little bit about your case. Have an attorney present so that we can't be subpoenaed based on what we talk about. That's the first thing. But go to LinkedIn, find Von Kliem at LinkedIn, connect, follow me. Also Force Science on LinkedIn and on all the social media platforms, Force Science, you'll find us out there, and we look forward to connecting with you.
Von, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. And if you'd like more information about the National Police Association, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Join the National Police Association in supporting our brave men and women in blue. Every day they put their lives on the line to keep us safe. But they need our help to continue their mission. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, progressive prosecutors, and the rest of the anti-police forces receive millions in donations from extremists like George Soros and woke companies like Amazon, Coca-Cola, Microsoft, and Google, to name a few. The National Police Association is fighting them in courts around the country, including the United States Supreme Court, defending officers who are being attacked for doing their jobs. Additionally, the National Police Association works year-round to pass tough-on-crime legislation to put and keep criminals behind bars. Consider going to nationalpolice.org and donating just $5 to keep us in the fight. Together, we can win. That is National